Good afternoon. I'm Ross Reynolds, Executive Producer of Community Engagement at KUOW. Thanks for joining KUOW and our partner, the University of Washington Alumni Association, for our presidential debate preview. The final debate preview before the election next Tuesday. Tonight's presidential debate is going to be taking place at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, and it begins at 6 p.m. this evening. To our virtual audience today, we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got a question or a comment for our guests, be sure and go to the comment section of the page and ask it. And I'd like to welcome our two guests. Leela Fernandes is director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, and former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna. Applause virtually, please. Thank you. Let's begin by talking about the topics for tonight's debate and maybe some brief impressions on what we might hear from the candidates and what we'd like to hear. The topics will be fighting COVID-19, American families, race in America, climate change, national security, and leadership. So we'll start with you, Rob. What do you expect to hear from Trump and Biden on the first issue, fighting COVID-19, and what would you like to hear from them on that issue? Rob, you're going to have to unmute. I think you're still muted.
Darn it. My opening line just went right out the window. I said I'll take fighting COVID-19 for $200. But, here's what I think he's going to say about COVID-19. We saw a little bit of a preview of it yesterday in one of his speeches. He's going to say, he'll say we're rounding the corner, which isn't actually true, as we know from the data. He'll say a vaccine is just about to be available. Also not quite true. But here's what I think his main message is going to be. He's going to say, vote for me and I will help you return to a normal life sooner. This is something his advisors apparently have been trying to get him to do for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I don't know why he hasn't. The reason that it's logical for him to take that tact is that Vice President Biden and his campaign have put so much emphasis on how terrible things are and how we all have to wear masks and do all these things. People are maybe feeling that there's just no end in sight. And so I think that it's a smart move by Trump to try to emphasize that if you vote for him, somehow things will get back to normal sooner for your family and you.
Leela Fernandes, what do you think we'll hear on COVID-19 from the two candidates, and what would you like to hear from them?
So I think I'm pretty much in agreement with Rob about what Trump is likely to say. I think Biden is likely to present himself as this, a statesman, calmer, reassuring, and also empathetic in terms of feeling people's grief. I think I'll shift maybe quicker to what I wish we would talk about, which is really just a more serious discussion of the economic consequences for people's lives, economic inequality, how people are supposed to survive, with the level of disruption. Not just in terms of job losses, but also in terms of, just basic things like taking care of children, schooling, education, and just what kinds of supports are going to be put in place for people to survive the next year or so.
Well, I'm sure that'll come up in the second topic, which is American families. And when it comes to that topic, I mean, American families, as you say, are in a dilemma right now. There's no relief coming from the federal government. There appears to be a deadlock on another COVID relief bill, although we might see something break loose before Election Day, depending on where it goes with the Senate. What would you like to hear the candidates say about American families? How would you like them to address that issue, Leela?
I think just get more of a sense of the immediacy, of the solutions which are needed, because they're long-term policies that need to be dealt with, but they're also immediate sort of crises, and sort of connecting this to the earlier question. I think they're so intertwined, it's hard to take them apart. There's also the question of whether we will not go through another health resource crisis like we did when the pandemic hit during the winter, which could also increase the hardship on healthcare workers, and then that has ripple effects. And so just some sense of what could be done soon, rather than sort of a long, sort of the usual sound bites which one would hear in debates. But I'm not sure that we'll hear that, but that would be the hope.
Rob, American families, what would you like to hear? What do you think you're going to hear?
Well, I think the two are the same in this case. What I'd like to hear, what I think we're going to hear, is President Trump claim that They will get another relief bill through, another stimulus bill through the Congress. He'll say that that he has proposed spending a lot of money to do that, with emphasis on more unemployment relief and other kinds of relief that will benefit families. He'll probably blame Speaker Pelosi for the fact that a bill hasn't moved. The real hangup, of course, is in the Senate, where Senate Republicans are not willing to include hundreds of billions of dollars for state government budgets and local government budgets. There doesn't seem to be that much difference over how much money to push through to individuals, except for the amount to increase unemployment. I think there's a disagreement about that. That can be solved by compromise. So if there could be an agreement to move forward to just focus on getting relief to families and small businesses, I think it could pass. I think that's what he should emphasize. And he'll, of course, President Trump will try to take credit for the relief that's already been provided to people, which has, had an impact. I mean, this is why we're not in the Great Depression. We don't have people standing in soup lines. And in fact, it's actually helped people pay down their credit card debt. Credit debt is at the lowest level in many, many years right now, because people use the checks they got in part to reduce their consumer debt. So he can address that as well.
Well, I'm very interested to see what happens in this third topic, which is climate change. And President Trump has pretty much denied climate change in many ways, and also said that pulled us out of the Paris Agreement and done other things that have rolled back efforts to deal with climate change. Rob, what do you think we're going to hear from the candidates on that issue, and what would you like to hear?
I think that President Trump will continue to downplay climate change as a risk. I don't think he'll deny it, but I think he'll try to muddle it by saying, well, we don't know how much the climate is changing because of human activity versus other factors. I think he'll also repeat his statement that we've done more in this country to reduce carbon emissions than anywhere in the world, the most in history. And what he's referring to there is that we did make a lot of progress for a period of years by substituting natural gas for coal. So it is somewhat factual, but this is a topic where Trump's weakness on speaking to policy really sort of comes out. Vice President Biden is much better at talking about policy. I don't think that President Trump will try to dive very deep at all into the policy specifics of the issue.
Joe Biden has pulled away from endorsing the Green New Deal, a big proposal from Congress, although he does endorse various aspects of the Green New Deal. When it comes to this issue of climate change, Leela, and of course, this goes way beyond U.S. borders, and your specialty is international affairs. What would you like to hear from the candidates? What do you think you'll hear on climate change?
So I think Rob is right in terms of what Trump is likely to say, possibly. I think Biden will probably talk about going back to the Paris Accords immediately, or as soon as possible, and use that as a kind of sign of his approach towards world affairs. I think Biden is also likely to, rather than focus on the Green New Deal, which is politicized, he's likely to tie climate change to producing jobs in the U.S. in terms of manufacturing, et cetera, new energy fields. But in some ways, we are so much far beyond what the Paris Accords would have done, that again, it's a little bit like the issue of economic relief. Climate change is already moving forward at a rapid pace, and it also has global implications, which then filter back to the United States in terms of migration, in terms of global inequality, et cetera. So to some extent, Biden will talk about embracing a future where we would deal with climate change, but it's a situation where if Biden does get elected, he's going to face enormous global challenges, because you can't undo the last 4 years or 10 years, et cetera.
Well, we'll get back to international policy a little bit later with you, Leela, but one of the topics tonight is national security. And I'm kind of wondering, based on what you've heard from the candidates, what you think they're going to say in this debate, and what would you like to have them say about national security?
So I think, just if I step back for a little bit, there's been very little discussion about foreign policy. I think national security right now is so interwoven into the mechanics of the election itself that I think it's going to be very difficult for any discussion to take place without actually talking about what we're hearing about, in terms of cyber terrorism, cyber security, voting security, and all of it is also tied to perceptions of, U.S. stability. So, so there's a lot more to national security. Obviously, we have stopped talking about, for example, trends in the Middle East. We haven't really talked much about North Korea, even though, again, just because our lens is not in North Korea, it's not like that nuclear program has gone away. But my sense is that given the politicization of the mechanics of voting in the context of cybersecurity, it's going to be very difficult to move beyond that, basically, in the course of this debate.
National security in times past, we might have talked about that in terms of U.S. relations with Russia, et cetera, but there actually is an internal aspect to national security with this election coming up a week from Tuesday, and that's the integrity of the whole election system. Rob McKenna, what do you think we'll hear on national security? What would you like to hear?
Well, I think that we'll hear President Trump make a couple of major points. He'll say we are more secure than ever in history. And what he'll point to in making that claim is that he's negotiated troop reductions in Afghanistan, in Iraq. He's brokered a deal between a couple of the Gulf states and Israel. He's offered a framework arms control agreement with Russia. He's talked about withdrawing 12,000 troops from Europe that are part of NATO. He's actually done a fair amount in his mind. And on North Korea, I think what he could do, although I don't really think this is a big campaign issue, so he may not do it. But what he could say is, look, when I came into office, it seemed like North Korea was shooting missiles over the Sea of Japan every other day or every week. That hasn't happened. And it's true. North Korea has not been as belligerent, has not been testing as many missiles as compared to before the engagement by Trump with their leaders. So he's got some things that he can point to. At the same time, he's going to take a pro-military stance. He needs to. He's really hurting with a lot of military folks right now because of his comments about people buried in military cemeteries in France. So he needs to come out sounding like he's pro-defense, pro-military, pro-armed forces. And he knows that this is an area where Vice President Biden can speak, because his son, my friend Beau Biden, went to Iraq while he was serving as Attorney General with me, and he's got a good story he can tell about that. So President Trump will probably want to sound, on the one hand, like we've never had a stronger military and we're standing up to our competitors like China. But on the other hand, he'll want to take credit for progress that's been made in Afghanistan and elsewhere, including the Middle East.
I'm thinking we might hear a lot about the Biden family from President Trump this evening. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. He'll try to work the emails that were reported in the New York Post into the story, that's for sure. I should have said this about climate change as well. Trump will go on the attack. He's behind. And when you're facing a challenger, what you have to do is you have to convince people you don't want to change horses. This guy who wants to replace me, you can't trust him. This is what Jimmy Carter tried to do to Ronald Reagan in 1980. So all Reagan had to do in the single debate that they had was to appear reasonable, to not sound crazy, to sound like someone you could trust. And it worked, because the biggest knock on Reagan was that he was the reincarnation of Barry Goldwater, and that he was going to get us into a nuclear war because he was hawkish. So on the one hand, Vice President Biden will want to come across as being sort of the safe, calm choice. And Trump's mission now is to make Biden untrustworthy in the mind of undecided voters and swing voters. He'll do that by attacking him over China. He'll attack and over Ukraine and the Hunter Biden emails. Of course, Biden will come right back at him over Trump's odd attitude towards Putin. One area where there's not a lot of daylight, really, in my view, is on China. They're both fairly hawkish on China, so you may not see a lot of contrast there. Although the report today or this week, that President Trump or his business has a bank account in China, that could come up. So it could be pretty raucous when we get down to this set of issues.
Leela, when it comes to China, international affairs is your specialty. Do you agree with Rob? We're not going to see a lot of difference between the two candidates on that.
Um, at one level, yes, because at one level, I think both candidates want to look tough on China. I think they'll take different tacks. I think that probably Biden will may want to emphasize the narrative where in which Trump was basically has been defending the Chinese leader. So there may be kind of a situation where each is trying to say that the other one is closer to China. I think what's a little bit unfortunate is that there'll be a lot of sort of language about sort of like demonizing China, but I'm not sure that we'll ever get into any substantive discussions of how the U.S. will actually effectively deal with China, because China is right now a significant power, and it's not going to be enough for any president to basically, talk about protectionism or talk about the Chinese threat. There's going to be some way in which the U.S. has going to have to effectively have relationships with China. So I don't think we'll get to that substance. I think it'll probably be mutual accusations flying across the screen.
Another one of the topics that will be discussed this evening is race in America. And you hear a topic head like that, and there are so many questions that could come out of it. But what do you expect the candidates to say on race in America, Leela, and what would you like to hear them say?
Well, in terms of race, there's no predicting what Trump will say. I will go back and note though that in terms of the discussion on China, Trump is also taking a very racialized line in terms of describing COVID as whatever the Chinese flu or whatever the thing is. And that is not a very productive way, in my view, of thinking about either COVID or thinking about how to deal with China. And some of the concerns that the U.S. government, for example, would have with what China is doing. And so race already is part of the discussion of COVID, for instance, in a different kind of way. But I think both. So I think Biden does have some challenges, to talk a little bit about his past record in terms of the crime bill, which people still do remember. I think that Biden is making a very strong case when he goes back to his narrative about the soul of America, that we are a different kind of country, that we have a choice to make. And as far as Trump goes, he has really crossed so many red lines on the question of race. It's just very, very difficult to know where that's going to go. And I think in many ways we think of national security as being about external threats or external issues, but some of the issues which are coming up around race, around extremist movements within the United States, are as much about national security. And so there's a way in which I think the explosiveness of this debate and of this election has to do with the fact that all these different sets of issues which we're lining up are all really kind of connected in significant ways.
McKenna, race in America is really gripped America. We've seen the president say that this is focused on what he calls the hooligans and the illegal rioters taking place around the country around race. What do you think we're going to hear tonight from the president and from Biden on the topic of race in America, and what would you like to hear them say?
Well, if I were advising the vice president, I would go right after Trump for refusing to clearly denounce white supremacism in the last debate. Which I think he really handled badly. Even his allies said that he really fumbled that one. I think that Leela's right that the president will go after Biden on the 94 Crime Control Act, and could even bring up Senator Harris's comments and attack on Biden about busing and Biden's apparent opposition to forced busing when he was a younger politician back in the 70s. So there are some vulnerabilities there. The question is, what is Trump trying to achieve here? Does he think he can peel minority voters off of Biden? Hard to see him doing that, but he might be able to keep some of them from, discourage some of them from voting, I suppose, by saying, you don't want to vote for this guy, he's not really going to help you. And we know that lower voter turnout among communities of color was a real problem for Hillary Clinton compared to Barack Obama. So I think that he'll go after Biden, but I think in terms of his own positions on the issue, he'll pivot very quickly away from the fundamental questions of systemic racism, for example, and he'll pivot toward his claims about economic progress for communities of color in our country. He'll He'll trot out statistics again about how fast jobs are being created and how much unemployment was dropping among African Americans, for example, before COVID. So he'll probably try to bring it back to his economic story from before COVID and then say, re-elect me and we'll get right back to those not so long ago good old days.
The president probably will be asked about refusing to condemn white supremacy in the strongest terms. At this point, can he really change his stripes on this? Several times he's had the opportunity and several times he hasn't done anything on it. I wonder if there's anything else he can say on recent America, but we will find out shortly.
Exactly.
Go ahead. Did you want to jump in
exactly.
on that?
I don't know what I'm sure they're going to come after him on it. Maybe the moderator will ask him, give him another chance to make the same. Just like the moderator could come after him and ask him to state again, will he accept the results of the election? But he's one of those guys, I think, who just becomes really stubborn and dug in, and he won't give the answer that he should give, from a political standpoint, just out of pure recalcitrance. He's just like, no, I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. This is where he doesn't seem to be very coachable by
that's his brand.
Absolutely right. It must be infuriating for his advisors that he won't just do the simple things like condemn the Proud Boys for what they are, a white supremacist group that there's no place for in this country.
The final big topic this evening will be the question of leadership, which again is such a broad topic, but you kind of alluded to one question, sub-question of that is, does an American leader, American president accept the results of the election? Leela, what do you think? What question would you ask on leadership if you were at the podium talking to Joe Biden and to Donald Trump this evening about leadership?
That's a question. It's almost hard to find an answer because the drama of the last debate is still in one's memory. I think there's so many different things that one could ask about leadership, and I think this is the one place where Biden will try to draw a sharp line in terms of the kind of model of leadership and integrity that he would want to counterpose to Trump. But I think I think there's a deeper question, which is the issue of whether the U.S. president sees himself, because they're both hims at this point, as the leader of the entire country. And I think the issue with Trump, and I will just go back to the previous topic because I think leadership is linked to questions of race and citizenship. I think there's more to it than Trump simply not wanting to, give in to the media. I think he also speaks in code to some of his ardent supporters on the extreme right, and there's a fundamental way in my view that Trump really sees himself as the leader of a particular section of the country. And he's never been able to, right from the beginning of his presidency, he's never, everybody kept waiting for the pivot for him to be, to kind of take up the mantle of being the president of the entire country. And he's never really made that pivot, but it may be, it's not just a question of whether he will or will not condemn white supremacists. It's really a question of who he thinks of himself as representing. And I think the question that leads us to is, what does a representative democracy mean if the presidential leader does not really even see himself as representing the whole country?
That's a great.
I want to ask that.
That is a great question. Are you the leader of the entire country or not? And Rob, certainly President Trump has not made many concessions at all to the other side throughout his presidency. What question would you like to ask Donald Trump and Joe Biden about leadership?
Well, I think it'd be a good question to ask, like, what kind of leader will you be, or do you see yourself as president or as a reelected president? To sort of ask them to speak to their kind of philosophy of the role of the presidency. I think Leela makes a good point that President Trump hasn't really tried to be the president of the entire country. He has been very happy dividing and conquering. And he did that in part in 2016, of course, as we now understand, by persuading blue-collar Democrats to move over and vote for him, mostly white, but not entirely. He got blue-collar workers to come over and on his side because he took stands that Chamber of Commerce Republicans abhorred, like reneging on trade deals or backing out of trade deals and taking on even our allies over trade issues and demanding that manufacturing jobs be returned, going after companies that were shipping manufacturing jobs abroad. He was definitely not laissez-faire. So I think that this is where being the incumbent gives you real advantages. You want to talk about leadership? I'd love to be, if I'm the incumbent, I want to be asked about leadership because I'm going to trot out a long list of examples of my leadership in foreign policy, on the economy, on trade, and so forth. So if he's wise, he'll use his opportunity to, play his greatest hits as he sees them as a strong leader, and then he'll pivot and go after Vice President Biden and attack him as a Washington, D.C. insider, who has in fact been in Washington, D.C. for 47 years, or was until he left the vice presidency. So he'll say, you don't want to put this guy back in charge. He's been there forever. He'll attack him that way. Vice President Biden, on the other hand, has his own lines. First of all, he's got his own positive stories to tell about things he's accomplished. Secondly, he can go after President Trump for failures of leadership, starting with COVID. He could talk about the high rate of turnover in the president's cabinet, people resigning in disgrace. I mean, he's got lots of ammunition that he can use as well. But again, I think what Vice President Biden needs to do here, if he wants to protect his lead, is that he needs to come across as a calm, thoughtful leader who really will try to represent everybody. I mean, that's a theme he's been using for a while now. I'm the Democratic nominee, but I'll be a president for all of America. That's a good theme for him. And so I think he'll probably come back to that theme in answering that question.
Hey, if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook Live and you've got a question, just go to the comment section and write it down, and we'll have it for our guests. There is a change in the rules for tonight's debate. For the 2-minute opening statements in each section, the opponent's microphone is going to be muted. This is kind of designed to prevent what we saw in the first debate when President Trump repeatedly interrupted. What kind of impact do you think this is going to have on the tenor of the debate, Rob?
I think it favors Vice President Biden because he's comfortable in a more conventional debate where he can, rattle off facts and figures and demonstrate his policy prowess. He's a policy wonk. And this format favors that approach, I think, just as it would have favored a Hillary Clinton, for example. I think that President Trump will not be able to resist the temptation to yell across the stage. Because one thing I've been thinking about is that the basic fact that they're going to be standing, whatever it is, like 10 or 12 feet apart.
Right.
And when Vice President Biden's mic is on, the moderator's mic might be on. I mean, wouldn't you still be able to hear someone of Trump's volume? I think he'll try it. It'll sound really odd, but I'm not entirely convinced that merely muting his microphone is going to prevent him or discourage him from interrupting. So we'll have to see.
Well, it'll be so interesting, Leela, if he does keep yelling and with his mic off, it'll be in the background. And he doesn't have an equal voice if he's just yelling off mic. Believe me, I've been on off mics to know that. Leela, what do you think the impact of this 2-minute statements without the microphone of the opponent? How do you think that'll affect what we see tonight?
So because there's so much anger and sort of energy that comes out of Trump, which we saw in the last debate, I'm actually wondering if that will intensify the conflict between Trump and the debate moderator who's asking the questions, because he has already in the news been raising issues about her credentials, her ability to be objective, and there's a gender and race dimension to that. So there's a possibility that there could still be some kind of really unpleasant exchanges, but between Trump and the moderator. If he's not able to do the sideways yelling.
Mm-hmm. Polls are suggesting that President Trump is behind. Rob, put your politician hat on. Is there anything he can do in this debate to ensure his followers get out and vote, or to win over any voters who have become disenchanted or are still undecided? What's his job one this evening?
Well,
job one. Oh, I'm sorry. So job one is for him to cast doubt on Vice President Biden's fitness for office and on his approach to the office. He's called Biden a puppet of the far left. He'll definitely try to tie Biden back to the Green New Deal. He'll trot out his $100 trillion price tag claim for that. He'll try to make Biden look extreme. He'll try to make him look unfit. And, as far as interrupting Biden is concerned, we know that he did that last time as part of a calculated strategy to try to knock him off balance and make him look weak and ineffective on the stage. The 2 minutes to speak without being interrupted, or at least without a hot mic on the other side, will make it harder for President Trump to use that tactic. But he'll still try to knock Vice President Biden off balance by making very personal attacks. Once again, as you already suggested, Ross, including attacks aimed at the Vice President's family.
Leela, we know that the president is behind. How do you think? What does he need to do this evening to pull the people over to his side, assuming that he can change it all? He's been pretty solid in his presentation, his affect, and his views on things. What do you think he has to do?
Well, I think the one thing he can do, which he has done, which he did in the last cycle, the last presidential election, is because the bar becomes so low and the expectations of some kind of crisis or catastrophe becomes higher in terms of the performance. He could just be completely reasonable for an hour and a half and just be really calm. And that's because he has done it in previous times. And then looking presidential for an hour and a half in the past has allowed him to win some just a change in narrative, but it may not work this time because I think the media has become more savvy about covering that, at least some parts of the media.
That would be a surprise. What about Joe Biden, Leela? What's job one for him in tonight's debate, do you think?
I think he has to be careful not to say to lapse into any gaffes, and just stick to message. I think one of the things which, if we go back to our topics, one of the things that it would be good for Biden to do is just bring everything back to healthcare. Every single aspect of what we're talking about is also linked to healthcare in terms of the economy, in terms of people's lives. And if he can stick to that message, which he has been doing in many of his political rallies, as well as playing the statesman, I think that's really all he needs to do.
Rob, I guess for the front runner, the main job one is to not blow it. But what else does Joe Biden need to do this evening?
Yeah, I think the look, it's kind of like to use a football metaphor. Do you protect the lead, or do you just keep after your opponent, just try to drive him into the ground? So I think that the smart move is to protect the lead and try to win over undecided voters or voters who are swinging back and forth and haven't could be moved back over to his column, particularly in the battleground states. However, we know that Vice President Biden has a temper. He's famous for it. We've seen it, and Trump will be prodding him and try to get that temper to come out. In which case, he may not be able to resist the opportunity to come after Trump pretty strongly. That doesn't necessarily hurt him, but if the number one goal for the vice president is to present himself as a comfortable, safe choice for those undecided and swing voters, it might not be the best use of his time. As a Republican, I will tell you that I've watched fellow Republicans for the last 4 years fervently wish that President Trump would just follow the teleprompter and just sound reasonable and calm and get off Twitter and on and on. And so many times we've told ourselves if he would just do those things, he would be in a better position. But he doesn't believe that. He really believes that what worked for him in 2016 will continue to work for him, that he can tap into undercurrents of anger and resentment, and that he can exploit the politicization of issues like climate change and race, where if you wear a face mask, you're giving in to the far left. Right? If you admit that climate change is real, you're just letting the left-wing environmentalists have their way. This is what's happened, unfortunately. So a lot of my conservative Republican friends or conservative independent friends just resent even admitting there's such a thing as racism, there's such a thing as climate change, because it seems like a concession to the other side, even though objectively speaking, it's really impossible to deny these things are real. And what we ought to be focusing on instead is, what do we do about them? Because when we refuse to admit those problems are real, we're effectively conceding the debate to the other side in terms of what should be done. If we can engage and say, actually, these are real problems, then we can start to influence what the right prescription for them is. That's what Trump ought to be doing. But I think at this point in the game, it's unlikely he's going to change his stripes or dramatically alter his approach.
If you've got a question, go into the comment section and write it out for us. Courtney has this question for you, Leela Fernandes. Among which international leaders is Trump's presidency viewed favorably? Where is it viewed unfavorably? What might be the global impact of a second Trump term?
That's a great question. And so, I think clearly in parts of Western Europe, there would be, amongst the leadership, there would be a strong desire to have Biden return in terms of countries like Germany and France, for example. Trump is popular in certain, with leadership in particular countries. For example, in some of the Arab and Gulf states, he's set up agreements. He's kind of he's played on some of the tensions between the Arab states and Iran, and Trump's kind of aggressive stance against Iran has helped him. Trump's willingness to look away from human rights abuses of other states has also, provided space for countries like Saudi Arabia, and he's clearly has a very strong connection there with the Saudi leader. In countries which Americans think less about, but for example, in India, for example, the leadership is fairly conservative, religious nationalist leadership, thinks highly of Trump. So it's a mixed picture. But there's also a difference between the leadership and people in these countries, because many of these countries, the leadership is not representative necessarily of sort of popular views. So I think the national views across the globe are more complex than what the leaders may think.
Yeah, and what are some of those important foreign policy issues that have not been addressed in this campaign? Foreign policy often gets short shrift in presidential campaigns. What do you wish there'd been more discussion of?
Well, climate change has economic implications, particularly for poor countries. There are real questions about so I think here's what I would say. I would say that in many ways we talk about the impact of this election for the future of democracy in some ways in the United States, but that also is a global issue, because if you look at what's happening globally, many formal democratic states have leaders. For example, I'm thinking of India and Brazil as two examples that are really undoing democratic rights in the context of a formal democracy. And so depending on what happens in the United States, we are part of a trend, but we're also, because the United States has always been, part of the United States foreign policy has always been standing, at least in theory, for democracy, not always in practice, but in theory. And so what does it mean if the democracy here starts to get weakened or not, or not function as well? It also provides license for other states to behave in certain ways. And also, I think Trump's isolationist also has allowed certain countries to protect their own, to sort of engage in their own regional expansionism. Take advantage of the sort of political vacuum around questions of human rights, territorial rights of smaller countries, and not just in Eastern Europe.
Well, President Trump has argued for an America First policy. He's also pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, as we've talked about. He's rewritten international accords. Before we talk about specifics, how do you, Leela, view what is a good foreign policy? I mean, how do we judge whether a foreign policy is good or whether it's bad? What are sort of the criteria? What are the lens which we should look through when we hear claims about foreign policy made?
I don't think there is a lens, because I think it really depends on your perspective. It depends on whether you're thinking about foreign policy purely in terms of strategic interests, whether you're thinking of foreign policy in terms of a set of values, and then how do those values get implemented. And so, and there obviously those get shaped by partisan and sort of ideological views. But I would say one of the biggest, if I were to point to a shortcoming in terms of discussions of foreign policy, it's that we often get, I think the two things, we often either make it about a question of intervention or withdrawal rather than the nature of engagement with other countries. And so it's about whether you have troops or whether you pull troops out. And I think we think of the success and failure of foreign policies in a very short time frame. Other countries often, like for example, if you think of even like Iran and China, they have a very long view. in terms of how they are thinking of establishing their own interests. And I think within the United States, partly because there's an immediacy that we want, we look for quick results, and we often don't have, as a people, I'm kind of generalizing, but as a national culture, we are often judging on very short-term measures. So if you go back to the North Korea example, for instance, it's true that there aren't any, for example, visible sort of examples of testing, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening under the radar. And in some ways, what we end up doing is we react after a crisis explodes. And so there's a question of the time frame which we use in terms of how we decide whether something is successful or failing.
Also, the time frame of the American presidency. I mean, 4 and 8 years is peanuts compared to the time frame that Russia and China are looking at, because their leaders are in power so much longer than that. Are there significant Trump administration actions on foreign policy, Leela Fernandes, where the jury is out? We just don't know whether they've succeeded or failed.
I guess we don't know what will be the consequences of the troop withdrawals. You know, I think that's a complicated situation, because I think keeping troops, for example, in Afghanistan was really there's really no evidence it was making a difference, and we were kind of stuck in a loop. But we don't know the immediate consequence of that withdrawal. I think there's a sense that ISIS is not as, at least immediately, a force which we're thinking about. That there's been some withdrawal in terms of ISIS's expanse. But a lot of times, when you use excessive military force, you can have an immediate victory with a particular group, and then that militant group just has a new formation, because the military strategy, which is used to repress the particular threat, has all these side effects in terms of how civilian populations are affected. And so I guess that's what I mean by the long-term horizon. And I don't think we know yet what the consequences are going to be.
The Fernandes of Joe Biden was vice president, so he wasn't in charge of foreign policy. But do you know of any areas of foreign policy that Biden was responsible for as vice president, and how he performed in that capacity? And kind of building on that, in terms of what he said in the campaign, how would you expect his foreign policy to be different from what we've seen from Donald Trump? You have mentioned the Paris Climate Accord, which is a distinct difference.
Well, it would clearly be different in terms of tone and in terms of substantive focus, because it would not be as isolationist or America first in terms of rhetoric. I think that, the challenges that Biden is going to face are going to be really, really extreme, because there's a way in which some of the things which are simmering in different regions might start to come to the surface when you have a transition in leadership in the US. And in terms of, what the strengths that Biden brings, there is a sense where, even if he may not have had a particular portfolio, that he was part of the entire Obama administration, because he had such a close partnership with Obama. He was part of that decision-making process. And I think the other last thing I will say quickly is that the other thing Biden will bring back, which is more invisible, is just a reliance on people with expertise in foreign policy. If you think of, for example, the hollowing out of the State Department, and where information is coming from, and I think that's kind of an invisible part of foreign policy, but it's really critical in terms of what are the frames of reference that the president is getting.
As I mentioned before, go in the comment section if you got a question for our guests. They're happy to try to answer them. Rai has a question here. There have been reports of surfacing election interference. If these issues start to gain traction, do you think it will affect the peaceful transfer of power if the president of the United States doesn't get reelected? Rob?
Yeah, I think there is a threat to the public perception of the validity of the election. Particularly if we see Trump ahead in key states on election night, and then because Democratic voters appear to be voting by mail more than Republican voters in those states, then you see Trump start to fall behind in those states. You could start to see claims of election fraud and manipulation surface based on evidence from the internet. We saw, for example, this week news from the National Intelligence Establishment that Iran appears to be behind a bunch of emails that are going out to people that are supposed to be from the Proud Boys. There's debates about whether they're designed to discourage turnout or have the opposite effect. But those kinds of interferences, plus whatever else comes to light that we don't know about right now, could definitely could definitely result in undermining confidence in the election, which is exactly what Iran is aiming for, and Russia too, if they're up to their old tricks as well, which they probably are. And this really surfaces, I think, or goes, takes us back to a question you asked a minute ago, which is what would we like to hear them talking about in terms of foreign policy challenges? I think figuring out what to do about Iran is one of those. Because there's obviously a current disagreement over the right way to contain their nuclear enrichment ambitions. There's a question about what to do about Russia and their use of cyber warfare, but they're by no means the only country that does that either. I mean, fortunately, President Trump's administration has taken China's cyber espionage and industrial espionage seriously. He's taken IP theft seriously as an issue. That was starting to happen under President Obama as well. But the process has accelerated and continued, and it's a discussion we need to have because we're not on the precipice of a shooting war here with China or anyone else. But what we are facing is a long, gradual erosion of American competitive advantages due in part to IP theft and related problems of sort of an economic strategy that China has been rolling out. So I'd like to hear the candidates talk more about what's to be done about those challenges and not just dwell on areas where they can snipe at each other.
Rob, what role do you think the courts are going to play in the outcome of this election? There are already a lot of disputed issues in courtrooms around the country, just on how the ballots will be counted, et cetera.
Right, and on issues such as whether or not ballots will be counted if they come in after the deadline, for example. So we saw the U.S. Supreme Court decline to review a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling that is going to allow ballots that arrive as long as 3 days after Election Day to still be counted. Because so many states in this election are moving to mail-in voting who really haven't done much mail-in voting in the past, there are going to be problems. One, we know two things about mail-in voting in Washington State because we've done it for a long time at a high level. Number one, we know it can work and it's not ripe for fraud and it is not going to result in a fraudulent election just because you're using mail to vote. But we know a second thing as well. We didn't get to all mail-in voting overnight or within a few months or within even a single year. And it is a little bit harder than it looks. And I'm pretty confident, unfortunately, that some states are going to have problems. We know, for example, that mail-in ballots have a higher spoliation rate than ballots or votes cast at the polling place for a variety of reasons.
I'm sorry, a spoliation rate? What's that mean?
What I mean is ballots that are thrown out, they're treated as spoiled by the canvassing boards because of problems like signatures that don't match. Think of hanging chads, but then multiply that by 5 or 10. So there are going to be controversies. Now, the one thing that could happen that would prevent widespread controversy and widespread loss of confidence in the election results would simply be a big victory, right? If Vice President Biden's lead holds, he should have a very large victory in the Electoral College. If he carries Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, maybe Florida, Arizona, he should have enough of an Electoral College victory that controversy in a single state or even a couple of states won't be viewed as having the effect of changing the election outcomes. So from that standpoint, if you want the election to be accepted quickly, you'll want a decisive win. If President Trump, however, appears to be winning, you could have a different set of reasons. You could have people on Biden's side really upset and concerned about voter suppression, about ballots not being counted that should have been counted, et cetera. So, a close election either way means that we're going to have a real headache, possibly up until January.
Well, by the time the ballots are counted a week from Tuesday, we'll have a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. Could this election end up in the Supreme Court as it did back in 2000? What pathway could take it to the High Court?
Yeah, so it could go back to the Supreme Court based on challenges to state decisions around the election, around ballots that were counted or not counted because they came in late or there were other problems with them when they were mailed in. You have armies of lawyers mobilizing in all of the battleground states, at least, prepared to contest votes that were not counted, or to contest whether they should be counted in the first instance if they come in after a certain date. I mean, we're used to mail-in voting in a certain way in this state. We've gotten used to the idea that in close elections we don't know the results for a while because we just require people to, you know, drop off their ballot or have it postmarked by election day. But for those listeners who aren't aware of it, in many states that's not the rule. In many states, the rule is you vote by mail. Your ballot has to be in the hands of the election officials by 8 p.m. on election night. There's going to be controversy around that, and there's going to be controversy around rejecting ballots that don't meet some of the requirements, like the right signature or a signature that matches. I think that, again, the only way around that is if you have margins that are large enough that it doesn't really matter if there's a dispute over a few thousand ballots.
Leela, Fernandes, there's an issue we haven't really touched upon, and that's U.S. immigration policy, which is actually an international relations issue. I wonder what you think about the two candidates' stands on this. President Trump has been very adamant about shutting down as much immigration as possible. How does that affect our standing in the world?
I think it has significant effects because it projects a certain image and reality in terms of how we think about questions of race and ethnicity and inclusion and multiculturalism. I think some of the draconian anti-immigrant policies also have raised questions of human rights within the United States in terms of policies of caging children and some of the more significant abuses which have been reported. And the things we also, there's so much that has happened over the last few years. There are things that we have forgotten. For example, the latest iteration of the Muslim ban, for example, has lots of effects on regular people in terms of students or people traveling or business members of countries whose leaders may be problematic, but who may be who are also part of everyday immigrant populations. So there's a clear contrast between Biden and Trump on that in terms of policies.
Amy is watching on YouTube, and she asks, if Trump loses, will the Republican Party stay with Trump's platform moving forward? Can they maintain that without Trump's celebrity personality as a driving force? Rob McKenna, as a Republican, what do you think?
That's a really good question. I think that there may be a lot of Republicans at the national level who see value in appealing to blue collar workers and workers who have been affected by trade policy, for example. So that could be a longer term shift. The anti-immigration stance, there definitely will be Republicans who want to stay with that. That, of course, is a classic example of short-term thinking. Because in the long run, this country is becoming more and more diverse. And if Republicans don't figure out how to attract more voters who are people of color, younger voters, et cetera, we could end up in the same place the Democrats found themselves in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, which is, really in a minority position as a sectional party. So I think that for all of that, what it's really going to come down to, Ross, is who the next presidential nominee is, who the leaders are in the party. And I think if it's Marco Rubio or Nikki Haley, for example, I think that they will go in a different direction than Trump has gone, and they need to, or else they're going to relegate our party to political minority status for a very long time.
President Trump has broken so many norms for how a U.S. president acts, but I think there are other leaders around the world that are also kind of, if not following Trump, also in this kind of norm-breaking mode. Leela, do you see other kind of proto-Trumps leading countries around the world that have come on board since the president's election, and how has that affected the world?
Well, I think that's, leaders are using some of Trump's strategies. So, for example, in the context of Nigeria, the recent violence, the characterization of fake news is often used, similarly in Philippines. So some of those strategies of delegitimizing journalists who are calling attention to, for example, violations of democratic norms or human rights in other countries. Leaders are often following the Trump playbook in terms of the way in which he engages in that. So I think there has been that kind of fine-grained impact.
Well, a question for both of you, and this goes back to the leadership question we talked about at the beginning. the Trump presidency, whether it ends next year or for
greater willingness by presidents to speak directly to the people using social media. I think that is possible. In terms of the overall tone and approach that President Trump has taken, a lot of that has to do with his own personality, and I don't think you can fake that if you're not willing to be really obnoxious and act the way that he does. I just can't see a lot of the current leaders who I expect will step up doing that. But I also don't think it's necessary, because the fact is there is more than one kind of leadership style that can be successful. President Trump figured out how to thread a needle and get himself elected in 2016 with his approach, the reality TV approach. He broke the norms for debates, for example, and turned those into, basically episodes of Survivor. And but the next person that could come along could take a very different approach, whether it's a Ben Sasse from Nebraska, Nikki Haley, Marco Rubio, any number of, they're going to take an approach that fits their own personality, their own philosophy, and plays to their own strengths. But they'll be doing so in a different context. If Vice President Biden wins this election, then they're going to be coming at it from a different standpoint, right? Because then they're going to be saying, well, look at all these terrible things that the incumbent is doing, or the incumbent party is doing. And that puts them in a different posture than if President Trump is reelected and they're trying to figure out how to persuade the public to give Republicans another 4 years in the White House, which is actually really hard to do. It's really hard to hold the White House after 8 years.
Leela, what are your thoughts on Trump's influence on leadership around the world? Has he ushered in a new style of leadership that will be with us for quite a long time, or will this be viewed as an anomaly? What do you think?
So it's hard to generalize in terms of global patterns, because every country has its own history, and
Sure.
So sometimes there's patterns which, because social media, sometimes there's a duplication of norms in the United States. But I think if I could answer it a different way, I think I would say the style of leadership will obviously not be the same if Trump is not the president. But the question is whether there's a change in terms of who we are as a people, because there is a large section of the country in the United States, and I'm turning back to us again, which has continued to express support for Trump, regardless of all of the norm breaking, regardless of all of the policies, regardless of all of the discussions of white supremacy and racism. And so the question is, what are the lingering implications for who we are as a people with regard to these sort of deeper issues, rather than, for me, just the style, because Trump's style sometimes makes us miss how his style is really touched a chord in large sections of the country, or at least allowed people to be complicit in it at the best.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time. I want to say thank you so much to our guests. Leela Fernandes is director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, a relatively new arrival to our area. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot from her in future years. And also former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Don't forget, I'm also a proud graduate of the Jackson School of International Studies. I'm delighted that Dr. Fernandes is there. It's terrific.
Thanks to everyone also for joining us. You can register for our other election-related events at kuow.org/events. If you're watching on YouTube today, please subscribe to our channel below. And a reminder that during this busy news cycle of the election season, you can find new KUOW and NPR stories at the NPR Newsroom podcast. Just jump in whenever you're ready to listen and pick or skip whatever stories that you want. KUOW and NPR's presidential debate coverage continues, so join us for more on 94.9 FM, or you can stream us live at kuow.org. Thanks for being with us this afternoon virtually. I look forward to seeing you in person again someday soon. Thanks. Good evening.